North Korea is a regime arming with missiles and weapons of mass destruction while starving its citizens. Iran aggressively pursues these weapons and exports terror, while an unelected few repress the Iranian people's hope for freedom. Iraq continues to flaunt its hostility toward America and to support terror. The Iraqi regime has plotted to develop anthrax and nerve gas and nuclear weapons for over a decade. This is a regime that has already used poison gas to murder thousands of its own citizens, leaving the bodies of mothers huddled over their dead children. This is a regime that agreed to international inspections, then kicked out the inspectors. This is a regime that has something to hide from the civilized world. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
This was the axis of evil in 2003, but in the almost 20 years since President George W. Bush made that speech, the situation has somewhat changed. I think that if you were to ask a Republican politician now what the axis of evil was, they'd reply with 3 countries: Russia, China, and Iran. I think that this assessment is partly right and partly wrong. I think fears about China's aggressive expansion, its hideous mixing of crony capitalism and Maoist communism, and its growing population and military capabilities are certainly justified. A war with China would be a nightmare, but a more hawkish vigilance toward Xi Jinping's China is not wrong. I don't feel this way about Russia. I think Republican orthodoxy's fears about Russia are largely misplaced, and I think this misplaced fear stems from a view of Vladimir Putin as a sort of neo-Soviet dictator, rather than a half-authoritarian right-wing leader with limited and realistic foreign policy goals that, in the long run, don't pose a major threat to the United States. Since Russia isn't the focus of this video, I'm going to link a Christopher Caldwell essay below that I think does the best job on summing up the truth about Putin's Russia. That leaves us with Iran, which, in my mind, is the trickiest of these 3 regimes to assess. On the one hand, the authoritarianism of the country's leaders is marked by a fanatical ideology that has both deep roots in Shia religion and a kind of, if not entirely illegitimate, Third World resentment at both American and Soviet intervention in the country for the past 100 years. They support gruesome sectarian militias in Iraq and Syria that, while indeed protecting the vulnerable Shia communities in those parts of the world, also engage in the torture and massacre of Kurds and Sunni Arabs. The Iranians also support Hezbollah, a parasitic gangster organization in Lebanon that, while certainly not on the level of the Taliban or the Islamic State, suffocates real political life in the country and does too much to take away a sense of democratic self-rule to the people of Lebanon. On the other hand, the Iranian regime is quickly weakening despite itself, as many of those who have traveled in the country have observed. It can no longer carry out its strict application of Sharia law as it once did. Protests in Lebanon and in Iraq have shown that Iranian influence over these 2 governments is becoming increasingly unpopular, and the fact that they seem to have no issue with the continuing rule of Bashar al-Assad, a member of the heretical Alawite sect, shows that they are not as ideologically rigid as they once were under Khomeini. Additionally, it's hard to always be upset at Iranian influence in the Middle East, when the other alternatives aren't much better. Yes, Bashar al-Assad is a tyrant, and he has provided aid and comfort to terrorists who have harmed Americans. But a Syria run by Bashar al-Assad is probably far better for both U.S. interests and the stability of Syria than any of the various Sunni rebel groups that made up the majority of the opposition throughout the course of the war, such as Jabhat al-Nusra, al-Qaeda's Syrian branch. And while the Iranian-backed Houthis in Yemen have been alleged to persecute Jewish and Baha'i minorities, a Saudi-run Yemen doesn't seem much better, along with the dozens of Sunni jihadist groups that have been running rampant in the country. So the question is, what is the best U.S. response to Iran? Well, I don't know enough to confidently say whether or not President Trump's withdrawal from the nuclear deal was the right idea. I can say that Iran's response, including attacking international shipping, crossed a dangerous line that seems more in line with a terrorist organization than a legitimate government. And while I'm not certain if the CIA is being truthful in its claims that there was an imminent threat against Americans, it's undoubtable, at least from what I've read, that General Qasem Soleimani was in the middle of a sustained campaign to harass Americans in Iraq for no morally coherent reason, After all, we do have a bizarre sort of alliance with Iran and Iraq, in that we both fought ISIS in the region, and we are both supporting the Shia-dominated government that rules there. There was no justifiable reason for Soleimani to direct these strikes on Americans, as well as direct the attack on our embassy. This is why I think Donald Trump was right in his strike on Soleimani. The strike, at least for now, was merely an assertion of deterrence against Iranian aggression against Americans, not an attempt at a full-scale conflict with Iran. That being said, as of now, there is no reason for the United States to ramp up any military tensions with Iran. While Iran is certainly a problem, the big question I have is whether or not they are always the biggest problem in the region. This is certainly the stance the United States has taken, as it has consistently supported Saudi Arabia and other Sunni groups over the Iranians and the Shias in the ongoing Cold War between the two regional powers. I wonder if this is always wise. Is there always a reason to even get involved in the first place? Yemen is a perfect example. While the Shia Houthis are certainly dangerous, they don't seem to be any more or less dangerous than the Sunni groups in Yemen that we have been supporting with our allies, Saudi Arabia. It would be better if we didn't get involved at all. Similarly, we should seriously consider pulling out of Iraq. The events of the past few months have revealed the current Iraqi regime to be nothing more of an Iranian puppet. For example, the Iraqi officials were seen at the funeral of one of the Shia militia leaders killed in the Soleimani strike. If Iran is supposedly our number one enemy in the region, how can we possibly support their client? And what is our alternative? Supporting a Sunni insurgency in Iraq to push out Iran? Once again, wading through the centuries of sectarian conflict that unfortunately characterize the region? How'd that work out the last half dozen times we've tried to do it? While Trump sent a clear and important message to Iran by killing Qasem Soleimani, the United States needs to realize that it cannot possibly win a long game against Iran in a military sense without risking causing more awful blowback. And besides, if the events of the past year prove anything, it's that the Iranians are already losing their grip on their Shia empire without any help from us. Perhaps the best thing to do concerning Iran is to simply wait.